Hey basketball coaches, today I'm going to talk to you about a strategy that you could use when you're doing tryouts for your basketball team. Let's get down to it. Now, number one, I am a huge fan of basically positionless basketball, which means that no matter what players that are trying out, they could be centers, they could be forwards, they could be point guards, but I want to see which players are the best all around. So number one is which players can shoot, which players can dribble, which players can run, which players are in shape, which players are tall, which players are short, which players are the best all-around basketball players. So how I figure this out is I number each one of the players. So I may have an assistant coach, or I may do this if I'm the only coach, where I'll have a sign-in sheet. I'll have their names, and then I'm going to assign them a number. And it's very basic. You could print it off yourself with my printer that I got next to me, which is just basically a list that you can make in Excel that has two columns. One is just numbers, and then a second column, which would be their names that they're printing in. And then from there, I would have them put their first name, last name, and then obviously if you've got forms that you need to fill out, then they'll have to fill those out. But if you don't, first name, last name, and then the number that is assigned to that name, I would get a Sharpie or some kind of a marker and mark their leg, number 1, 2, 3, 4, whatever. And then that way I can tell, hey, number 3 is Bobby, number 5 is Kyle, number 10 is whoever. And then from there, I'm able to then have a secondary list. Or you can even make it multiple columns. And the columns that I use, so I have multiple columns, I don't just have two. I used my first year coaching, I just had the two columns, and then I would write down what they're good at next to it, but it's just easier just by having a check mark or a code system. So I would have basically column 1 is numbers, column 2 is their name. And then I would have multiple columns after. I would have basically their height for number 1, that's a major thing for me, their height and their wingspan. I want to know both. So when they're coming in for their first tryout, I would have a marking system. They are 6 feet. Wingspan, get a measuring tape, hold it, see how long their wingspan is. To me, wingspan is important because with wingspan, basically what you're learning at that point is higher rebound percentages, better defense possibilities, but also, especially when you're talking about younger players, that actually helps out with knowing their future when it comes to their height. Another one is what I don't measure anymore, but I used to have managers who would measure this, which is from their waist down to their ankles, because that's actually another big giveaway as well, versus their height. A percentage of their leg length versus their overall height. The higher percentage of their body that's taken up by their legs is actually a good chance of them growing taller 5 years from now, 3 years from now, depending on how old they are. So keep that in mind if you're looking for a future possible center who is not a center right now. Going from there, that's just a small little tip for you. But going from there, knowing their overall game. Can they dribble? Can they shoot? Can they get rebounds? Can they play defense? These are all columns, and I would have a scale from 1 to 10. So literally the first 30-40 minutes of the practice, I'm not marking anything off. I want to see who the best is, who the worst is, give them marks, and then everyone else fills out the middle. That's how I like to do it. That way I can gauge who's there. And then another simple question that I like to ask as well when they're coming in is, I have a whole, literally a whole sheet. And one of the questions I like to ask is, what other sports do you play? This is a major question because if you're a defensive coach like myself, go check out my defensive books in the description below. If there's a player or a couple of players who say they play rep or club soccer, that is a major plus on my side. Because if they're playing club soccer, that means that their foot speed is amazing, which means that their defense is going to be amazing. There's a few things that you can teach, and there's a few things that you have issues teaching. Number 1, shooting. For me, to teach that is ridiculously easy. But defensive ability, defensive mindset, seems to be a bit hard for me to teach. However, soccer players have that. I don't know what it is, but soccer players, they are defensive gods. I had one player when I used to coach in another city. He was a club soccer player, and he was my 12th man. He was a starting offensive whatever. I'm not a soccer person, but a starting offensive soccer person. And he was... I wanted him just because of the soccer. There was no other soccer players at the tryout, so I just picked him as my 12th man. I was like, yeah, whatever. 12th man never gets played anyways. So yeah, you're on the team. And he ended up being my starter in the last half of the season, mainly because every team we played in the second half had one really great offensive player, and go play defense. He would shut them down. And that's what soccer players do. They shut down the best players on the other team because they can move their feet before they go and attack people with hands, generally speaking, because that's what soccer players do in game. So keep that in mind. Sometimes I know some coaches will ask for if they're football players. That just helps them understand, hey, you're like gigantic. You might be a really good center because you're tough already for playing football. So things like that. Volleyball players tend to jump really high. There's a wide range of sports that can help out with basketball. So if you can kind of figure out a list of sports that you like your players to play, then you can kind of go by it. For me, volleyball for jumping, football if it's a center, and then just soccer in general because their foot speed. And then for the next part of the strategy is understanding what type of an offense or what type of an offensive set do you think certain groups of players will play. So trying to figure out, hey, I personally like running a 5-out and a triangle offense, so I'll try and figure out players or find players who will benefit both. I will always pick the tallest kid in the tryout no matter what. That is just something I already do. That's no matter what. I've picked out a 6'4" kid who was in grade 8 once, and he ended up being one of the best centers who came out of Ontario. And he wasn't the most coordinated, and a lot of other coaches said, why did you pick him? And I said, because he has a future. He ended up being like 6'10". Massive, massive guy. And he was a great center. And so just keep that in mind. If you have a hunch about a player, pick him in that 12th spot in your mind, and then you can always move him up. Next is understanding the history of the player, but also understanding what your goal is. So I always like to have a goal of having a fun team to be with. There's nothing worse than running a team and everyone's just pissed off at each other. If you're going to have a team that's pissed off at each other, it's not going to be fun. But if you've got a team if you've got a couple of players who like to joke around and have fun, if you've got a whole team that's full of that, no matter how much fun they're having, if they've got that serious mindset where, hey, they're joking around 1 minute, but when it comes to game time, they are narrow focused, we're going to win this game, that is the best team that you can coach. And if you can find players to kind of fit that mold, you're going to have a hell of a season. And then also knowing the history. So a little bit of a history of myself as a coach. There was one player who I picked for a team, and there was 2 other coaches who previously coached that kid. And they said, don't pick him, don't pick him. He may be one of your best, but he will cause trouble. And I didn't listen. And I picked him because he was good. He was probably the 4th or 5th best player on the team. And I was like, I'm not listening to these other 2 coaches, even though one of those coaches was my own coach when I was younger, and I respect the living hell out of him. I didn't listen to him, and that was a massive mistake. If you've got other coaches who have previously coached a kid who say, do not pick that kid, stay away, don't pick him, that probably means don't pick him. He ended up costing me a coaching position because of the way things worked out. He was one of the best. I ended up sitting him 1 game because he wasn't doing anything in practice, and I sat him 1 game because he wasn't doing anything in practice, which led to parents complaining, that parent complaining, to the kid complaining, and there was a whole politic thing with the club, and I got demoted to assistant, head coach got put up. It was horrible. And it all came from kid not listening and doing anything in practice to punishing him to, in a way of him only playing the third quarter, which is a quarter that didn't matter in that game. And me saying, hey, are you going to start running? Which then led me to basically saying, hey, are you going to run next practice and all the previous next practices so that we can get going as a team again and the players won't argue about you not running and things like that. It was just a big, everyone upset with this one player, so I just wanted to kind of settle the score saying, okay, if he's not doing anything in practice and you guys are upset because he's still getting playing time, and then other players are starting to get upset and they're not doing stuff in practice, I just wanted to put it all down and say, nope, that's not happening. You're sitting, those guys are playing. Next game you're in, if you practice or if you keep on practicing and giving your full so that everyone stays happy. And basically, long story short, parents complained to the executive, who was actually the principal, leader, whoever, executive person of a private school, and they threatened him to pull the kid out of the private school, and it was a whole big long thing. And basically, will never coach for that club ever again, and I hope nobody ever does have that issue with that club ever again. However, that's my long story. So if basically, long story short is, if other people are saying don't pick a player, you probably shouldn't pick a player. That's a great strategy to have. Anyways, I hope that this video has helped you and gave you a couple of background stories of myself as a coach. It might have sounded like I was complaining, but I wasn't. I just wanted to give you guys a great example of what to and what to not do, maybe. Anyways, if you've liked this video, hit that like button, subscribe. I think I've talked way too long in this video. If you like these shirts, go check them out in the link down below. Check out my Unbeatable basketball defense books again down below, and I will see you guys again in our next video.